prepared to take questions for anyone on the panel, including the original business. We didn't take them at the end, as we said, of each presentation, because we'd still be on the first presentation. But at this point, you can feel free to ask questions of anyone that you would like, or would anyone like to raise their hand and ask a question? Yes, ma'am. Would you identify yourself, please? Yes. Yes, okay.
Curious as to how we talked about a population focus and patient engagement, and just how diverse populations are being included, particularly as you look at these databases. An experience with the Sentinel Initiative, there was a publication that looked at ACE inhibitors, and they were unable, based with the Sentinel system, to do any analyses that addressed the incidence of an adverse event that's actually called out in the label for African Americans. So the agency, the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology, and the Sentinel Group actually looked at an alternative database, found a huge signal. So I'm just wondering how this population focus, probably a more granular approach, is being incorporated into the big data work that's underway with IMEDS.
Alan, would you like to address the question to one of the members, sounds like, to your panel, and find out if anyone wants to respond?
Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, does any of the original panelists want to take it, or also Susan Gruber, you're here. Anyone want to respond to that? Marcus, Susan?
Or Marcus?
I'll share the mic with you here. That is a common problem, especially in certain data sources. If you look at the original data sources for Sentinel, as an example, and claims databases really don't have the information you're looking for, even though many of us covet having it. So there's a couple of mechanisms to get it in the short term. We do survey work sometimes, or we go to medical record, which is somewhat reliable in some cases for getting information like that, and blend it back into some of the analyses that we do. It's harder, it's more onerous, it's more costly to do it, a lot more time consuming. In the long run, the idea is to get that information from other sources and blend it in. So we do believe the electronic health record can be a good source, especially as we're working with those institutions and the providers putting the information in. If we're very careful and talking to them about how we want to use the information, getting them to populate that information reliably, then I think that will improve the quality of our evidence much more so to be able to include race and ethnicity into the analyses. I think it's a very, very important, actually one of the most important next steps for this type of work, no doubt. So thanks for bringing that up.
Just as an example also, we're looking at some special data sets. There's something called MePrep, which is a data set on pregnant women, drugs that have caused adverse events in pregnant women, and it's also tied to offspring. And so we're looking at special data sets as well as maybe potentially being incorporated into that part of IMED, so that for groups like that, in particular special populations, we might be able to do a better job and provide a resource that would be useful to FDA as well as the community that's developing drugs. And there are other such resources around we've seen in vaccines and some other things. So some of it will be opportunistic, and then at some point we may start to look at what other data do we need to collect, or what other kind of data set do we need to create. So.
Also just wanted to also mention that there are opportunities in terms of training. Our office is funding fellowships and looking at health disparities in genomics, but to, opportunities where we can advance the dialogue, and would also like to cite that we have been charged by Congress in terms of the last big body of legislation, FDA Safety and Innovation Act, Section 907, which required the agency to take a deep look at demographic subgroup inclusion, including the elderly. So, thank you.
Thank you. It's very good to know. Okay. Ellen, you had a question. Why don't you ask now? I'm not sure that's on. If that isn't on it, we'll use the other one. Try that one.
If it isn't, this is.
Okay.
So, Nancy, specifically on the predictive tox, this has been a long time, and we're focused on a pilot. This is important because we need proof of principle. What I don't know is the exact budget that we need and what we think we need to execute this, because it's so important in having some success on this project so we can move forward. So maybe you can expand a little bit about what our needs are specifically, what we're asking for, and what our, I guess, business plan is.
Sure. Oh, I hate microphones. So yeah, we're working on honing the budget now. I think we have a much better idea now of the specific technical pieces that need to come into play, and we've gotten access to some of the Pfizer data, and that's helping us scope out what it's going to cost to do the curation, bring the data in. So we at least have a better feel for what this first chunk of work is going to cost, and we can extrapolate out. We have our data curators and people building the warehouse helping us figure out those pieces. So in the next 2 months, we should have a much better idea about a projected budget. And Jane and I have both been engaging potential funders, both health foundations as well as scientific foundations.
Yeah, I think it's important to have the timeline and what the budget is before we understand the scope, because we do need to get this off, and it would be great to kind of get the input from some of the technical experts or some people on the board on that one.
Right, and the, what's really been helpful is the 6 data sets from Pfizer coming in on a particular TKI has now given us some hands-on experience, so now that we can put that together. So that's been a really key thing in the last couple of months, so.
And I would add, we'll cover in our board meeting the issue of how we develop absolutely defined deliverables, budgets, and times to do that as the way that we have to proceed in the future if we're going to grow as an organization. So this question that Ellen asked is actually a subset related to all the activities that we have. It's not directed at the individual.
It
Okay.
is fine.
Other questions? Yes, please identify yourself.
Hi, Subha Madhavan, Georgetown University Medical Center and the MedStar Health System. As a data scientist, my interest is in connecting multi-omics data to health and health outcomes. My question is specifically probably to either Susan or to Nancy about the data sets that are available within the IMED system in terms of biomarkers for predicting drug toxicity. So is there information either in terms of genetic markers or imaging biomarkers that can help build that predictive model? Because we're actually, the reason I'm asking this question, we're actually building a predictive model for cardiotoxicity in trastuzumab-treated breast cancer patients, and we find that the clinical parameters that you use and the LVEF parameters and the cardiology data really doesn't give you a very strong predictive model. So we're looking for other types of information that we can potentially add to this model to strengthen that predictive model. So just wondering what sorts of other information that may be available within the IMED's laboratory to help strengthen those predictive models.
So we don't have that kind of information in the IMED's research lab. And this also goes to an even larger question. The data that we do have, it's all been de-identified. So if there were data on the same patient from another source, we would not be able to connect that in the lab. And that's a strength for privacy, security, but it's a real weakness for research and getting at answers that I think is much larger than just the IMED's research lab. That's something kind of as a nation or as a world we have to address.
Okay. Other questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
Robert Rugwama from Merck. The first question I have is regarding the research lab. A big portion of industry do have the same database or license to use the databases that are in the lab, on the MS Research Lab. I'm just wondering if there is a way that industry can have access, at least the portion of the research lab which uses this data, because we already do have a good portion of industry have
Troy?
license to use these databases.
Troy, I think you're the best person to answer.
Troy had to leave.
Troy had to leave, then
Maybe Susan could.
Susan could.
Susan, go ahead.
Right.
Yeah. So in fact, industry already is working and active in the research lab. We're not there to do commercial work, but we are there for methods development and development of tools. So submit your proposal. There's a online imeds.reaganudall.org/onboarding, capital O, capital B with a dash in the middle. You can submit a proposal and you can get in the lab.
Thank you. Then the other issue is regarding, thanks so much also for converting the databases that you have into the common data model, the Sentinel. The one for the OMAP common data model was already available from their website. I'm just wondering if you do have also the ETLs to transfer the data that you have into the into the Sentinel Common Data Mode available?
I think the answer is no. And I asked Mini Sentinel, I asked Jeff Brown if those were publicly available through Mini Sentinel, and he said no, because it's almost like unique for every site, because the source is different everywhere, and so there is no one process. So obviously, Mark Cater heads our research lab. They're doing it in our research lab. So email Mark Cater. I don't know the answer. I don't know how he's doing it, and I don't know if that's publicly available.
Other questions from the audience? Yeah, please, just come to the front and ask.
Yu Zhao, FDA. I just started learning the MS lab, and I found it's fascinating. My question is about the data fresher. It's for Susan or for Troy. Is there a plan to add more data partners in the MS data lab? And also, is there a plan to annually refresh or quarterly refresh of the data?
Yes, we do currently quarterly refresh the data, so that's ongoing. And as far as adding new data sources, it's something we'd like to do. We have a lot of things we'd like to do, and we don't have the funding to do all of them. We did a survey of our lab users, and CPRD and Medicare were sort of two of the data sets that the lab users at that time were most interested in seeing in the lab. But I don't think we're currently talking about spending more money to do that right now. But Sally mentioned we have been talking with patients like me to see if we can get some of that data in the lab, and that would be an entirely different kind of data for people to try to exploit.
Okay, there was another question down there. Yes, sir?
Hi, Michael Levy with the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. There was an allusion earlier to the use of big data for uses other than safety monitoring and risk signal identification. I was wondering if anyone could speak to that more.
Would anyone in the group like to speak to that?
I'll do it.
What?
Oh. We made a strategic decision with IMEDS that we would start in safety, but there is a discussion that at some point we'll be looking at effectiveness, not probably in the next year or so, but at some point we would be, I assume that's where you're going, yeah, okay. So we're not quite there yet. We've decided safety made the most sense for us to start with, but yes, there is, eventually we would get to that point.
Yeah, this is a big issue, whether this data ever could be used for CER.
that's
And
part of it.
Corey's looking at this, and Cornet, so, I mean, whether this ever can be useful, and whether that should be what our role is another issue. But for sure, people have thought about that.
Yeah,
But
it's
again,
definitely on the-
lots of big questions on the utility of that data for this, or our role in that, to be honest with you, as well.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Annie Saha. I'm from the Center for Devices. It's more of a comment really than a question, but sort of just in terms of how Reagan-Udall collaborates with other sort of groups. So in CDRH, we have the Medical Device Epidemiology Network, and a lot of what was talked about with IMEDS has a lot of similarities and potential areas of cross-fertilization. So, you know, being able to utilize various resources and leveraging each other rather than trying to go off on different pieces. So more of a
Yeah.
comment. than
And
anything
actually,
else.
I've had conversations with Steve about that, and I know our people work all the time on that, and there are many, many areas in which there are new work on access to devices, like there are access to drugs, et cetera. So I would just say to you publicly that we aspire to be able to interact with anyone, and if we don't call you, call us.
I would like to answer that also, because, you know, there's a lot of experience in FNIH on this, and so we do work with the directors, and so essentially the process should be that the center director should really come to us with a project they think is viable for us. And just recently from the Science Board, we spoke to Jeff Shoren and on this. So we have to, you know, what we have to take on is what we can accomplish and what is viable, and have to have priority setting. But I think our goal, as we establish Reagan-Udall, is to really expand and do projects that are useful to all of the centers, and certainly devices are important. And we're going to be talking later about 21st century cures, and there's a lot of opportunity for stuff there as well.
And
Okay.
could I,
Yes,
could
please go
I
ahead,
quickly
Alan.
take off my Reagan-Udall hat? But for my Pew position, we would love to see the unique device identifier integrated into claims and health records so that it could be used in the same way that we're now using drug data.
And Alan's been working on that for a long time and very hard. If there is time, if there is one more question, I'll take it. If not, we're going to adjourn and then reassemble our board at 12:30 in the next room. There's lunch, and then we'll reassemble and start the meeting at 12:30. But out of courtesy, I'll ask, is there one last question? Yes, sir.
I have another one. So there's mentioned that 60% of the funds comes from industry, and there are two types of industry: the pharmaceutical industry in healthcare and the providers like Kaiser's and Blue Cross Blue Shield. So which industry is meant here? Is it mostly the pharmaceutical? Because
Yes.
they have actually almost conflicting interest in terms of the observational data they want to look
Let me just turn around. Are we talking about for IMEDs, or are we talking about in general for Reagan-Udall?
General, I think. It's, yeah, it's,
Georges, do you want to comment? You provided some charts on that, so I know you have an idea of the answer.
Yeah, that's primarily industry funding, but the purpose of this whole thing is to be a partnership. And as we grow, we grow. And certainly a lot of our early funding was in industry, but the intent is that to get as many parts of industry to partner together in ways in which they would never, ever be able to partner by themselves. So a lot of those conflict of interest go away when you bring two different competing organizations together with very, very different interests, but you get them in a room around a strategic project. You get enormous collaboration. And then to the extent we can get other dollars to also participate in that process, including FDA dollars, I think it makes a really wonderful partnership.
But I know at FNIH it was mostly pharmacy groups. Is the other, is there at least 50% of the providers represented, or it's
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, first of all, FNIH, yes, has a very large percentage of industry funding. I think what you have to ask is, are we transparent, and is there conflict of interest that we're being very careful about? And the answer is yes to that. Of course, we want dollars from multiple stakeholders, including the FDA and healthcare companies and other groups that can fund. The diversity of funding is important, but the more important thing is, are we transparent? Are we asking questions that are important? And do we have very strong conflict of interest in our bylaws and in all the projects? And the answer is yes.
Okay, with that as a final comment, I'll thank you for coming. We'll adjourn for the board. We'll meet around the wall in just a few moments at 12:30. Thank you all.